If you think you know everything about World War II, you're wrong. Because what happened on June 22nd, 1941, changed history forever. And what Stalin said when he learned about the Nazi betrayal will shock you. Hit that subscribe button right now. You won't believe what comes next. August 23rd, 1939. Moscow. The champagne flowed freely in the gilded chambers of the Kremlin. And to men who despised each other clinked glasses like old friends. Joseph Stalin and Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, had just signed the most shocking diplomatic agreement of the century, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that promised 10 years of peace. The world was stunned. Communism and fascism, sworn enemies, now allies. But what the world didn't know was far worse. Hidden in the treaty's secret protocols was a plan to carve up Eastern Europe like a butcher dividing meat. Poland would be split down the middle. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Romania would fall under Soviet control. This wasn't just a treaty. It was a conspiracy between two dictators to redraw the map of Europe in blood. Stalin raised his glass that night and toasted Hitler's health. He called the Führer a man he could trust. But trust was a currency neither man believed in. Hitler saw the pact as a tactical move, a temporary maneuver to buy time before the real war began. Stalin saw it as a shield, a way to keep the German war machine at bay while the Red Army, crippled by his own brutal purges, rebuilt its strength. Both men were lying to each other. Both knew it, and neither cared. Within days, the pact unleashed hell. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi forces smashed into Poland from the west. 16 days later, Soviet troops poured in from the east. Poland ceased to exist. The Second World War had begun, and Stalin and Hitler were partners in its ignition. But in Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched with dread. He knew what most Americans didn't yet understand. This war would eventually reach their shores. And when it did, the United States would have to choose sides in a conflict, where the lines between good and evil were blurred by the partnership of two monstrous regimes. Roosevelt paced the Oval Office in the autumn of 1939, the weight of the world pressing against his shoulders. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had shattered any illusion of stability in Europe. Isolationism dominated American politics. The public wanted nothing to do with another European bloodbath. But Roosevelt saw the storm coming. He knew that if Hitler and Stalin divided Europe between them, democracy itself would be suffocated. The question wasn't if America would enter the war. It was when, and on whose side. The alliance between Stalin and Hitler posed a nightmarish scenario for American strategists. If the two dictatorships remained united, they would control the resources, territory, and manpower of an entire continent. No force on earth could stop them. Roosevelt began a delicate dance, preparing the nation for war while publicly maintaining neutrality. He pushed through the Lend-Lease Act to supply Britain with weapons. He expanded the military. He spoke in radio addresses about the dangers of tyranny. But he couldn't tell the American people the full truth, that the Nazi-Soviet alliance was the most dangerous threat to freedom the world had ever seen. Stalin, meanwhile, was playing his own game. He believed he had bought the Soviet Union precious time. The Red Army had been gutted by his paranoid purges in 1937, and he needed years to rebuild. The pact gave him breathing room. He watched as Hitler conquered France in the spring of 1940, as the Luftwaffe bombed London, as Nazi submarines prowled the Atlantic. and he convinced himself that Hitler would never dare turn east. Not yet. Not while Britain still fought. Stalin ignored every warning. British intelligence sent alerts. His own spies in Germany reported troop movements toward the Soviet border. Even a defecting German soldier crossed the lines in June 1941 to warn of an imminent invasion. Stalin dismissed them all. He believed Hitler was rational. He believed the pact would hold. He was catastrophically wrong. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft surged across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's long-planned betrayal, shattered the early morning silence with artillery thunder and Stuka screams. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Nazi war machine tore into Soviet territory. Hitler had finally revealed his true intention: to annihilate the Soviet Union, enslave its people, and seize its vast resources for the Third Reich. In Moscow, Stalin received the first reports just after dawn. German bombers were hitting Soviet cities. Panzer divisions were racing deep into Soviet territory. The Non-Aggression Pact, the alliance that had defined 2 years of global chaos, was worthless paper. Stalin's response was silence. Not the silence of calculation, but the silence of a man whose world had just collapsed. For hours, he said nothing. He sat in his office, pale, motionless, unable to process the betrayal. His closest advisors waited nervously. Would he rally the nation? Would he organize the defense? Would he even speak? When Stalin finally emerged from his shock, his first words were chilling. Lenin founded our state, and we've let it go to hell. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a call to arms. It was the private admission of a dictator who realized he had been outmaneuvered. Stalin had trusted Hitler just enough to let his guard down, and now the Soviet Union was paying the price. Within days, the Red Army was in full retreat. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers surrendered. The Wehrmacht advanced so quickly that Soviet commanders couldn't organize coherent defenses. By the end of the first week, the Germans had penetrated 200 miles into Soviet territory, but Stalin's paralysis didn't last. On July 3, 1941, 11 days after the invasion began, he addressed the Soviet people by radio. His voice was tense, but steady. He called the citizens brothers and sisters, a phrase he had never used before. He admitted the gravity of the situation. He ordered a scorched earth policy, destroying everything the Germans might use. And he invoked Russian nationalism, not communist ideology, to rally the population. The enemy is cruel and implacable, Stalin said. He is out to seize our lands, our grain, our oil. He is out to restore the rule of the landlords, destroy national culture, turn our peoples into slaves of German princes and barons. It was a speech born of desperation, but it worked. The Soviet people, terrified and angry, began to fight back. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union changed everything for Franklin Roosevelt. Suddenly, the two dictators were enemies. The alliance that had threatened to dominate Europe was destroyed. But it also presented Roosevelt with an impossible decision. Should the United States support Stalin, the man who had partnered with Hitler to carve up Poland, the man whose regime had murdered millions in purges and forced collectivization, the man who ruled through terror and oppression? Roosevelt chose pragmatism over principle. If Hitler invaded hell, Winston Churchill famously said, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Roosevelt felt the same. On June 24, 1941, just 2 days after Barbarossa began, Roosevelt pledged American support to the Soviet Union. He extended lendless aid, sending weapons, food, vehicles, and supplies to Stalin's crumbling armies. It was a political gamble. American isolationists were outraged. How could the United States support a communist dictatorship? How could Roosevelt align with a man who had enabled Hitler's conquest of Europe? But Roosevelt understood the brutal mathematics of global war. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would control the resources of an entire continent. He would be unstoppable. The Red Army, for all its weaknesses, was the only force capable of bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. Roosevelt needed Stalin to survive, and Stalin needed Roosevelt's industrial might to keep fighting. The relationship was born not of trust, but of mutual necessity. Throughout the summer and fall of 1941, the situation on the Eastern Front grew more desperate. German forces reached the outskirts of Leningrad and laid siege to the city. They drove toward Moscow, the Soviet capital. By October, Nazi advance units were close enough to see the Kremlin's spires through their binoculars. Soviet officials began evacuating government documents and gold reserves. Stalin himself considered fleeing the city. But in early November, something extraordinary happened. The Germans stalled. Winter arrived early in 1941. Temperatures plummeted to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers, equipped for a quick summer campaign, froze in their thin uniforms. Tank engines wouldn't start. Weapons jammed. Supply lines, stretched across hundreds of miles of devastated Soviet territory, collapsed. And the Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, launched a counteroffensive on December 5, 1941. For the first time since Barbarossa began, the Wehrmacht retreated. 2 days later, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was finally, fully at war. Roosevelt had been maneuvering toward this moment for years, but the shock of Pearl Harbor galvanized the nation in a way his speeches never could. America's industrial power, the greatest in the world, was now committed to defeating the Axis powers, and that meant supporting Stalin, no matter how uncomfortable the alliance. The partnership between the United States and the Soviet Union was strange, tense, and contradictory. Roosevelt sent billions of dollars in aid to Stalin. American factories produced trucks, jeeps, locomotives, and aircraft that poured into Soviet ports. American wheat fed Soviet soldiers. Without this aid, the Red Army might have collapsed. But Stalin was never grateful. He constantly demanded more. He accused the Americans and British of deliberately delaying the opening of a second front in Western Europe, forcing the Soviets to bear the brunt of the fighting. He was paranoid, suspicious, and impossible to satisfy. But Roosevelt understood something that Stalin couldn't admit. The Soviet Union's survival depended on American support. The Red Army was brave, resilient, and willing to accept staggering casualties, but it couldn't have sustained the fight without American logistics. Trucks moved Soviet infantry. American-supplied aircraft dominated Soviet skies. Even the boots on Red Army soldiers' feet often came from American factories. The aid was a lifeline, and Stalin knew it, even if he would never say it aloud. As the war dragged on, Stalin reflected bitterly on his decision to sign the pact with Hitler. He never spoke about it publicly, but his private comments reveal a man haunted by his miscalculation. He had believed he could outwit Hitler. He had believed the pact would protect the Soviet Union. Instead, it had lulled him into complacency and nearly destroyed his country. The Nazi invasion cost the Soviet Union more than 27 million lives, the highest death toll of any nation in the war. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The Western Soviet Union was a wasteland of scorched earth, mass graves, and shattered infrastructure. Yet Stalin also understood that the pact had served a purpose. It had bought the Soviet Union 2 years to rebuild the Red Army. Without those 2 years, the Wehrmacht might have crushed the Soviets even faster in 1941. The pact had allowed Stalin to seize territory in Eastern Europe, territory that became a buffer zone against the Nazi onslaught. And the pact had divided Hitler's enemies, making the Western democracies hesitant to support the Soviet Union, until it was almost too late. But the cost was incalculable. The Soviet Union's partnership with Nazi Germany had enabled the invasion of Poland, the beginning of World War II. It had given Hitler the confidence to wage war on multiple fronts. It had destroyed any moral authority Stalin might have claimed in opposing fascism. And when Hitler finally turned on Stalin, the betrayal was total. The pact's secret protocols, which Stalin denied existed until his death, became a source of shame for Soviet leaders for decades. For Americans, the Stalin-Hitler Pact and its collapse shaped their understanding of the war. Roosevelt and his advisors saw the conflict not as a simple battle between good and evil, but as a complex struggle where necessity forced strange alliances. The United States had to work with Stalin to defeat Hitler, but Americans never forgot that Stalin had once been Hitler's partner. That memory poisoned the wartime alliance and set the stage for the Cold War. American soldiers, fighting their way across Europe and the Pacific, struggled to reconcile the propaganda they were told with the reality they saw. The Soviet Union was an ally, but it was also a brutal dictatorship. American supply convoys braved Nazi submarines to deliver aid to Murmansk. American pilots flew alongside Soviet airmen, but there was no warmth in the partnership. Stalin refused to allow American observers to see how Soviet forces operated. He imprisoned or executed Soviet citizens who had too much contact with Americans. He prepared, even in the midst of the war, for the coming confrontation with the West. Roosevelt tried to manage the alliance with optimism and charm. He believed he could win Stalin's trust through personal diplomacy. At the Tehran Conference in 1943 and the Yalta Conference in 1945, Roosevelt sat across from Stalin and tried to find common ground, but Stalin was unmoved. He saw Roosevelt as a temporary partner, not a friend. He took every concession Roosevelt offered and gave nothing in return. He planned the post-war domination of Eastern Europe even as he shook Roosevelt's hand and promised free elections. The American public, caught up in the patriotic fervor of the war, accepted the alliance with Stalin because they had to, but they never loved it. Polls showed deep suspicion of Soviet intentions. Newspapers questioned whether Stalin was truly committed to democracy. And when the war ended, the alliance collapsed almost immediately. The Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe and refused to leave. The Iron Curtain descended. The Cold War began. Decades later, historians continue to debate the Stalin-Hitler Pact and its aftermath. Some argue that Stalin had no choice, that the Western democracies had failed to form an alliance with the Soviet Union against Hitler, forcing Stalin to seek his own security. Others argue that Stalin's decision to partner with Hitler was a moral catastrophe that enabled Nazi aggression and cost millions of lives. Both perspectives contain truth. What remains undeniable is the human cost. The pact directly led to the invasion of Poland, the beginning of the war, and the eventual Nazi assault on the Soviet Union. More than 60 million people died in World War II. The Soviet Union lost more than any other nation. The United States lost over 400,000 soldiers. The Holocaust consumed 6 million Jews. Cities across Europe and Asia were obliterated. And it all traced back, in part, to that night in August 1939 when Stalin and Ribbentrop clinked champagne glasses in the Kremlin. Stalin never apologized for the pact. He defended it as a necessary measure to protect Soviet security. He blamed the West for refusing to stand against Hitler earlier. He positioned himself as the leader who saved the Soviet Union from Nazi conquest, conveniently omitting his role in enabling that conquest to begin. And when Stalin died in 1953, the pact's secret protocols remained hidden. Soviet leaders continued to deny their existence until 1989, when the Soviet government finally admitted the truth and declared the pact null and void for America. The legacy of the Stalin-Hitler Pact is a reminder that alliances in war are often born of necessity, not morality. Roosevelt made the right decision to support Stalin against Hitler. The alternative, a Nazi-dominated Europe, would have been catastrophic, but the alliance with Stalin came at a cost. It legitimized Soviet power. It allowed Stalin to expand his empire, and it set the stage for 50 years of Cold War conflict. So what did Stalin say when Hitler broke the pact? The answer is complicated, because Stalin said many things, and most of them revealed a man in denial, shock, and rage. His first response was paralysis. His second was despair. His third was defiance. But the most revealing statement came years later, in a private conversation with a trusted aide. Stalin admitted that he had made a mistake. He had trusted Hitler too much. He had believed the pact would hold longer, and he had underestimated the Nazi determination to destroy the Soviet Union. But Stalin also said something else, something that reveals the cold pragmatism at the heart of his worldview. He said that the pact, despite its ultimate failure, had been necessary. It had bought time. It had given the Soviet Union a chance to prepare. And without it, the Soviet Union might have fallen in 1939. Instead of surviving to 1945, Stalin's regret was not moral. It was tactical. He regretted being outmaneuvered, not the decision to ally with Hitler in the first place. That distinction matters because it shaped the post-war world. Stalin emerged from World War II not as a chastened leader who had learned the dangers of partnering with evil, but as a victorious dictator who believed his methods had been vindicated. The Soviet Union had survived. It had defeated Nazi Germany. It had expanded its territory and influence. And Stalin concluded that ruthlessness, paranoia, and power were the keys to success. That worldview defined Soviet policy for decades and plunged the world into the Cold War. The story of Stalin, Hitler, and Roosevelt is ultimately about choices. Stalin chose to partner with Hitler, believing it would protect the Soviet Union. Hitler chose to betray Stalin, believing he could conquer the Soviet Union and rule Europe. Roosevelt chose to support Stalin, believing it was the only way to defeat Hitler. Each choice had consequences that reverberated across the globe. But the question that haunts this story is simple. Could it have been different? Could Stalin have refused the pact and forced Hitler to fight a two-front war from the beginning? Could the Western democracies have formed an alliance with Stalin earlier, preventing the pact altogether? Could Roosevelt have found a way to defeat Hitler without empowering Stalin? The answers are unknowable. History records what happened, not what might have been. What we do know is that the Stalin-Hitler Pact was one of the most consequential diplomatic agreements in history. It enabled World War II to begin. It shaped the alliances that defined the conflict. It determined which nations survived and which were destroyed, and it left scars that lasted long after the war ended. The Pact's legacy is a reminder that in the darkest moments of history, the line between ally and enemy is often razor-thin, and the choices leaders make in those moments can change the world forever. Think about this. If Stalin hadn't signed that pact, if Hitler had been forced to fight a two-front war from the start, would World War II have happened at all? Or would it have been even worse? History doesn't give second chances. It only gives lessons. And the lesson of the Stalin-Hitler Pact is that the alliances we make in desperation can define the world for generations.